Welcome to Michigan's WW1 Centennial News Report for July 2016. I'm your host, Dennis Skupinski. During this program, we're going to look at the WW1 peace movement and its Michigan connection. WW1 Centennial, Michigan News for July 2016. Please contact your state senator and state assembly person and let them know that you want Senate Bill 670 passed. A century ago, July 1st, 1916. The Battle of the Somme began July 1st and lasted until November 1916. The battle was intended to hasten the victory for the Allies and was the largest land battle during the First World War on the Western Front. More than 1 million men were wounded or killed, making it one of the bloodiest battles in human history. The first day on the Somme, July 1st, saw a serious defeat for the German Second Army, which was forced out of its first position by the French Sixth Army. On the British side, however, it was the worst day in history for the British Army, which suffered over 57,000 casualties, mainly in front of the Albert-Bapaume Road. The British troops on the Somme were comprised of pre-war regulars, territorial force, and Kitchener's army, a force of volunteer recruits including mainly battalions recruited from the same places and occupations. July 7, 1916, David Lloyd George succeeds the late Lord Kitchener as British Secretary of State for War. July 9, 1916, the Hashemite forces, led by the Grand Sharif Hussein, finally took Mecca, with the help of Egyptian artillery. The indiscriminate Ottoman artillery fire, which did much damage to Mecca, turned out to be a potent propaganda weapon for the Hashemites, who portrayed the Ottomans as desecrating Islam's most holy city. July 14, 1916, the British forces launched the second phase of the Somme offensive, the Battle of Bazentin Ridge. Commander-in-Chief General Haig and Fourth Army General Rawlinson both were encouraged by the capture of 2 German regimental commanders and their staff, and the Fourth Army wrote that the enemy is in confusion and demoralized. Later information showed that Germans were forced into expedients, such as sending forward a recruit depot as reinforcements. 3 days later, the Fourth Army noted that German morale was improving due mainly to better supply of the front line, and by the end of July, British hopes for immediate success had failed. On July 23, 1916, the Battle of Pozieres started. It was a battle for the French village that was located on a ridge. It was a joint operation between the British and Australian forces, although Australia had more forces involved in the battle. The fighting ended in about 2 weeks, with the Allies in possession of the northern plateau east of the village, in a position to menace the German bastion at Thiepval from the rear. The costs have been very large to both sides. One Australian historian wrote that Pozieres Ridge is more densely sown with Australian sacrifice than any other place on earth. July 27, 1916, British sea captain Charles Fryatt was executed by the Germans. His boat, the SS Brussels, was attempting to ram a German U-boat in 1915 after it was attacked by it. In 1916, he was court-martialed and sentenced to death, although he was a civilian non-combatant. International outrage followed his executions near Bruges, Belgium. In 1919, his body was reburied with full honors in the United Kingdom. On July 30, 1916, was the first combined Franco-British air operation on the Western Front. At the outbreak of the war, American peace societies counted among their ranks Business tycoons and social reformers. The pre-war peace movement was for the affluent, prestigious, and practical reform movement. However, this changed in 4 short years between 1914 and 1918. The small elite and establishment peace movement of the early war years was overcome by a mass working class and increasingly radical anti-militaristic and anti-capitalist movement of later years. Driven by increasingly dire economic conditions and angered by wartime conscription, the American anti-war movement of 1917-1918 rose to near revolutionary-like levels before being suppressed by an aggressive government repression. In 1915, U.S. activists Jane Addams, Carrie Chapman Catt, and others formed a Women's Peace Party. Later that year, they sent a delegation to the International Congress of Women for a Permanent Peace, held at The Hague, Netherlands. Selected to represent the United States were Jane Addams and Emily Green Balch. There are also representatives from Great Britain, Netherlands, Italy, Hungary, Germany. They visited 14 leaders of European countries, including Russia, asking them to sign a non-aggression pact. Women's peace sentiments were not typically recorded officially by the governments, but information about female dissenters is usually found in their memoirs, in records of women's peace organizations, and in newspaper articles and letters to the editor. Though the women were unable to stop the war, they had set the groundwork for decades of intercontinental peace efforts, including the Women's Peace Party's successor, the Women's International League of Peace and Freedom, which still works on behalf of women's issues and for peace around the world. Henry Ford in early 1915 began to express pacifist sentiment and denounced the ongoing war in Europe. Later during the year, American peace activist Louis Lochner and Hungarian journalist Rosika Schwimmer approached Ford, now commonly recognized as a pacifist, with a proposal to launch an amateur diplomatic mission to Europe to broker an end to the war. Schwimmer claimed to have diplomatic correspondence that proved that the European powers were willing to negotiate. Ford agreed to finance the peace campaign. Henry Ford initially sought President Wilson's endorsement of his diplomatic undertaking. Ford and Lochner secured a meeting with President Wilson at the White House and proposed that Wilson officially commission Ford's mission to Europe. Although Wilson was sympathetic to Ford's aims, he declined the offer on the ground that the venture was most unlikely to succeed. Disappointed by the president's response, Ford told Lochner that Wilson was a small man. Henry Ford was undeterred by Wilson's refusal to endorse the expedition and planned it as a private delegation to Europe. On November 24, 1915, he announced to a New York City press conference that he had chartered the ocean liner Oscar II for a diplomatic mission to Europe and invited the most prominent pacifists of the age to join him. Henry Ford had hoped to create enough publicity to prompt the belligerent nations to convene a peace conference and mediate the end to the World War, but the mission was widely mocked by the press, which referred to the Oscar II as the ship of fools, as well as the peace ship. Infighting between the activists, mockery by the press contingent on board, and an outbreak of influenza marred the voyage. 4 days after the Oscar II arrived in Norway, a beleaguered and physically ill Ford abandoned the mission and returned to the United States. The peace mission was unsuccessful, but reinforced Ford's reputation as a supporter of unusual causes. Although Henry Ford's peace mission was a failure because it failed to bring the end of the war, it did give rise to the peace movement. Now the peace movement was getting publicity, it was well funded and organized. Gone are the days of peace activists meeting with government officials and there being no record of their meeting. The peace activists now were funded and organized. Rebecca Shelley was born in Pennsylvania in 1887. In 1904, her father moved to Leelanau County, Michigan, to become a pastor of the local evangelical congregation. Rebecca taught school 2 years in Leelanau County before quitting in 1907 to attend the University of Michigan. She majored in German and graduated Phi Beta Kappa in 1910. She spent the next 5 years teaching German in Hayward, Wisconsin, Everett, Washington, and Freeport, Illinois. While traveling with friends in Germany during the summer of 1911, Rebecca met Franz Willman, a German literature and music critic to whom she became engaged in 1913. Their plan had been for Franz to move to the United States, but in August of 1914 war was declared and Franz was called up to active duty in the German army. The World War and her personal situation led her to become a pacifist. When she read about the proposed International Congress of Women at The Hague, Rebecca wrote to Jane Addams to persuade Addams to allow her to attend as an American delegate. After the conference, Rebecca toured Germany with Angela Morgan, a fellow delegate. In Munich, she met with Franz, who died later in the war. After returning home, Rebecca had numerous contributions to the peace movement. She was a central figure in the Ford Peace Ship, December 1915, the American Neutral Conference Committee, spring 1916 to February 1917, the Emergency Peace Federation, February to July 1917, and the People's Council of America, August 1917 to 1918. In 1918, stress and exhaustion forced Rebecca to return to Michigan, where she purchased a trade journal, Modern Poetry Breeder, which she published through most of the 1920s. In 1922, Rebecca met and married Felix Martin Rathmer, an electrical engineer from Germany. Having married a foreign citizen weeks before the pertinent law expired, Rebecca lost her American citizenship. Then she refused to take the naturalization oath, which included a clause promising to bear arms in defense of the country. It was only after a lengthy and publicized legal fight that her U.S. citizenship was restored in 1944. Years later, she became active in the pacifist movement. She was the organizer of the World Peace Month in 1952, and in the early 1950s, she founded the Battle Creek chapter of the Women's International League of Peace and Freedom. After the death of her husband in 1959, Rebecca dedicated her Battle Creek property as the Peaceways Foundation. In 1964, she ran for vice president on the Peace Party ticket with Herbert Hoover, a cousin of the former president. From 1968 until 1977, she publicly dressed in mourning as a protest against the Vietnam War. She made extensive tours of Europe and Southeast Asia, conducting peace vigils at embassies and war monuments. In 1984, Rebecca Shelley died at the age of 97.
Time to lay the sword and gun.